Out the way past cool. What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Woodoofoot, and I ain't gonna lie. I got this. We're gonna do a watch it with me, man. For all my people out there, I appreciate the subscribers, man. I definitely appreciate the love. I'm doing it for my people. I'm also educating myself in this whole process because y'all making me get on my game of researching. Because back in the days, I used to be heavy on the research, heavy on the, dissecting information. Just want to say for the record, I definitely used to be a peer educator. My dad, RIP to my pops. He was a motivational speaker for EOC, which is Economic Opportunities, and they did a lot of street outreach and health prevention stuff, and some street outreach, in my activism situation, my studioism situation when I'm trying to learn and trying to, get into my groove. But I appreciate y'all, spending, time to actually watch my content. I love and appreciate y'all. Also, thank you for sharing information in the comments. I definitely appreciate that. I looked into some of that, and it's inspirational, and it's actually interesting because it inspires you to actually learn more. And it's interesting because you never know what you could find out. From being taught from other people and just looking at things from other viewpoints and stuff like that. And I just want to, everybody that's enjoying my content. I mean, appreciate y'all, love y'all, man. I'm trying to make my way up to keep growing the audience, trying to get monetized on this platform, so I can actually, make this my living, I can do this for a living instead of having to, go work for corporate America. But, sometimes we gotta do what we gotta do. But that's my whole process, man. I'm trying to create more content, reach out to y'all. If y'all got any ideas y'all want me to, create something or what you want to learn or know. But me, I'm the type of person where I just create things off of my top of my head. Like, I don't know what everybody want to see, so that's why you see like it's a variety of different things on my channel. But I'm gonna narrow it down to making it more like a teacher, if you will, or like a social advocate that kind of like speak on things that I feel passion that feels that I take passion that I have passion for, and that I hold true and I value. You know, excuse me. I don't really know about the whole social advocate thing, but I do want to learn things and speak on it and share it with other people who don't know, because it could be a platform used for us to learn and build and learn from each other. So I got this video. Man. I'm gonna watch it with y'all. I'm gonna have to stop it from time to time, but y'all gonna see what it's about. It's about the slave trade, and I thought it was important for me to find this type of content. Although it's not my content, it is something that I felt like was important for me to share on my channel, on my platform, with my subscribers, my viewers. I appreciate the love and the support. Appreciate all the subscribers. We're gonna try to get me to like at least 500 subscribers, y'all. We're gonna try to get me to 500 and more. We're gonna try to keep growing. I'm gonna keep learning and building and finding out different things. As I know, like this really wasn't my channel was basically for this. Like, I don't really want to get into the whole detail about that, but I like to talk and I like to share with y'all. For those people who are just seeing me and wondering what my channel's about, my channel is kind of diverse. I really don't know what to show my audience, so I just chose a different variety of things to to cover, if it's a story or if I'm just vlogging or reacting or something like that. So that's why you see a different diverse of things. But at the same time, if I do narrow it down, my channel down, it'll be based upon information. You know, I do like doing the story times too. Like you see the Wendigo Forest video I did. I do like doing stuff like that. But I don't want to hold y'all too much. That'll do it past cool. It's your boy, I am Littlefoot, signing out. Peace. Earlier, I got this video I want to watch with y'all. For my people, my African individuals, my African brothers and sisters all over, you know, my African brothers and sisters that's in the diaspora, that's all over the world, man. I just want to watch this video with y'all. I want y'all to learn about the slave trade. Oh, I'm also learning too, so we're going to watch this video together. So all my African brothers and sisters that's in the diaspora, that's all over the world, that's tuned in to me, even in the States, we just going to watch this video because I learned something from it. Well, I didn't really watch the whole video. I watched like probably a good couple seconds of it, but I was like, oh nah, this is cool. I gotta go share this with my people. So they're gonna watch this with me. Y'all know. Here we go.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy.
Numbers involved in the Atlantic slave trade are truly staggering. From 1500 to 1880 CE, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas, and about 15% of those people died during the journey.
The majority of enslaved Africans were taken from 6 primary regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bada Benin, the Bada Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. An estimated 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships and carried through what became known as the Middle Passage.
Hold on, y'all. Just in case y'all didn't catch that, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna just bring my picture down right here and let y'all see that, alright?
Moved from Africa to the Americas, and about 15% of those people died during the journey.
The majority of enslaved Africans were taken from 6 primary regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bada Benin, the Bada Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. An estimated 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships and carried through what became known as the Middle Passage, which moved across the Atlantic and included many different destinations.
Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at a market very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks, again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror.
The idea that I am not human.
Alright, see how they used to brand them like cattle? That brings me to the question, is that why they called it cattle slavery? I mean, y'all could sound off in the comments and let me know, but I'm just thinking, like, is that why they called it cattle slavery? Because the slaves were actually branded like cattle? Basically to distinguish them from each other and to say that this is my property, like this slave belongs to master such and such, you know?
That I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse. Nothing.
The history of humanity is filled with oppression, dominance, war, and slavery. Since the beginning of time, people in different parts of the world have forced their fellow humans into slavery. The tale of the Atlantic slave trade is the history of millions of Africans who were forced out of their communities by European slave traders and shipped across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. When Portugal and Spain started conquering and establishing colonies in the New World in the early 1500s, they forcefully made the Indians work their plantations.
Alright, just to say this, I do got like some type of Portuguese and Irish in my blood. You know, I'm predominantly African American, predominantly American African, predominantly African, you know, but I learned this from a family reunion back in like 2000 and I think 12 or 2013 or 14. I had a family reunion and I met some of my other family members, and they're really fair skinned, like kind of like light, like you see how my complexion is. They kind of lighter than me, and they're Irish, but the Portuguese side comes from my it's not really my blood, I could say. It's in my nana's husband was Portuguese, or my nana's, yeah, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, that's why I just mentioned that. My bad, y'all.
However, European diseases and the violence of conquest led to the death of many of the Indian slaves. This led to a labor shortage.
And the reason why I mentioned that, that's not saying to glorify nothing or trying to, that's just saying they mentioned that. So that means that I didn't know that the Portuguese started, you know, the slave. Well, they didn't start it, but they was one of the contributors to it, you know. And it's interesting because, you know, Portuguese, because, you know, my family's last name is Costa, you know, and it's Costa and De Costa, like, you know, or Costa and De Costa, you know. That's why I'm saying that, because my family last name really is Costa, and that's a Portuguese last name. So, yeah. But my name, Ryan, that's my real name. My name is Ryan. It is Irish, and it stands for, like, Little King. You can look it up. The origin of it is from Ireland, and there are Africans who live in Ireland, who inhabited Ireland before it was whitewashed or stuff, and stuff like that. Also, St. Patrick's Day is actually a day that's glorifying the slaughter and genocide of African people who stayed, or melanated people, African people descent, who stayed in Ireland. There are Black Irish individuals, Black Irish or African Irish, if you will.
in Europe and made the Europeans look towards Africa for a solution.
And if I'm wrong, because I remember reading about this and stuff like that. But if I'm wrong, correct me, please, because I like learning and I appreciate, all the love and the info. So please.
As voyages to Africa progressed, and with many expeditions by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, Africa became a major source of supply of slaves to Europe. In the Spanish West Indies, as well as the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, the Indian slaves were gradually replaced by Africans. These Africans were stripped of their identity and occupation. To refer to them as just slaves is incorrect because before being captured by the European, many of them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and many more. They were husbands, fathers, wives, children, and mothers. They had origins and
See, that adds to my other point. Like, well, I don't know if I made this point, but I'm just saying, like, that just comes to show before Africans were brought into slavery, cattle slavery, they had lives. We had lives. We were living okay, sustaining ourselves, had a livelihood in our country. Like, we were doing our own thing. We had our own lives, man. It's not like we was just there in Africa twiddling our thumbs and kicking up dirt and throwing our hands in the sky and just killing animals and drinking their blood and doing crazy stuff like that. We actually had civilized lifestyles, you know? So they can't even say that slaves were dumb or that was a conditioning that had to happen to get them in that condition, to get them in that state, you know? So, yeah.
heritage. But when the Europeans came and took over their communities, they became captives and had to be boarded on large ships and taken to Europe. The European slavers dispersed them across the Americas and different parts of Europe. They were forced to lead lives under terrible conditions and face severe labor conditions. They were stripped and flogged and forced to work very long hours, often under terrible weather and health conditions. The transatlantic slave trade transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved.
And then that brings me to my other point. Can't they just leave us alone, bro? Like, they treat us like crap. But at the same time, they needed us to build their country. They needed us to build the economy. They needed us to start the foundation, bro. And then they turn around and still treat us like crap, bro. Come on now, like something's gotta give. It can't always be like this. You see, they clearly took us from what we was already doing. We was doing our own thing, but they come and interrupted our lives, so we can help them do their thing over here in America, in other places that they took us to. Why we can't just be left alone? And then they want to say we can't get reparations. Why not? Y'all owe us. They owe us so much, bro. If it wasn't for them, most lifestyles wouldn't have been interrupted. Most families wouldn't have been broken apart. Most people wouldn't have lost their original trait, skill, talent, birthright, land, culture.
Black Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. You might have heard of the triangular trade, right? And how Africa was a major part of this trade, although suffering economic.
Thinking about that, don't that remind you of the Bermuda Triangle? Isn't that where, see that same area right there is the same area where the Bermuda Triangle is at I think somewhere over there. Where all the planes keep disappearing and ships be disappearing and stuff like that. That's because weird stuff happened. Like, our ancestors, like, that's a lot of energy. That's a lot of energy. I think, if I'm not mistaken, y'all sound off in the comments if y'all know what I'm talking about. Like, isn't that where all the hurricanes and stuff come from? Like, isn't that where all the hurricanes travel through that same area, right? Through that triangular slave trade area, right? If I'm not mistaken. Y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, I think that's exactly where the hurricanes formulate, right there in that little area.
While the other two parts that made up the triangle enjoyed huge economic benefits. We'll get to that shortly. The first slave voyage from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526. But even before this period, Africans were bought as slaves directly from Europe, and even native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy didn't permit the transportation of African slaves from Africa, not due to a sense of moral value or humanity, but because they believed Africans were barbaric and that they would corrupt the European society and introduce pagan and non-Christian practices to the country. However,
Isn't that low-key saying they was kind of scared of us, though? They know who we were, bro. They know who we are. They know. That's why they had to strip us from the stuff that we knew. Because they ain't want us to put no curses or no plagues or nothing like that with our culture. You feel what I'm saying? They was scared of us, low-key. Let's be honest here. They was low-key scared of us. You feel me? They ain't want us to do none of that stuff that we could do and put it on them. Yo, bro, come on.
over
Man.
the years, due to economic reasons, there was a U-turn in that decision. And on August 18, 1518, King Charles V granted a charter to Lorenzo de Gorevad to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish American colonies. Over time, King Charles changed the law established by his grandparents and then permitted slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa on the condition that they would be converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. With this new decree in place, there was an explosion in the number of slaves moved from Africa to America. There was an immediate expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast and then brought them to the Americas. Generally, the European
Remember in the beginning when they showed them what was it? Some Gambia, Sierra Leone, West Coast, West Guard or something like that. The West Guard, if I'm not mistaken. But the countries they showed, those are all coastal areas, right? So they had all of our ancestors held up on them in them coastal countries, on the coast, inside them forts they talking about. Bro, this is ridiculous. Like, it's ridiculous, man. Like, it's really ridiculous. Like, man, the torture, the torment, the inhumane treatment, the nerve.
slave traders did not participate in the raids because their life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was less than a year due to the widespread malaria infection. So the majority of people that were transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa that were captured by other West Africans and sold to the Western European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was essential to the whole economics of the triangular trade route, and European colonies in America needed the supply of slaves for their plantations. Speaking of essential, it's essential for you to like this video.
And you know what's funny too? This goes back to my other point. That's been spreading around. People when that what's that guy named? The Hispanic guy that said the Latinos built this country? Where? Where? What part? I'll wait. No disrespect to my Afro Latinos and my Latino and that's out there. No disrespect to nobody. I'm just saying where. You clearly see we had the best work ethic. We replaced the Indians. They wanted us over the Indians. You feel what I'm saying? Not saying I'm not saying nothing. No disrespect. I'm always saying respectful stuff. You feel what I'm saying? I'm just saying no disrespect because it's not intended to be disrespectful. Somebody decided to take it the wrong way, or I indirectly offend someone. It's not intended, It's just out of respect and passion that I really have for the stuff that I do, and then the knowledge I learn about my people mainly. So basically I'm saying this to say, like, you clearly see we got taken from our homeland to America to build their entire economic system, bro. Because we have, from what they say and from what I see right here, y'all see for yourself. Because we have the greatest work ethic. The black African Americans, Africans in general, have the greatest work ethic in the world. African individuals, Africans, well, no matter where you're from, Afro Latino, African, African Latino, African Caribbean, African from the diaspora, African American, African Canadian, African Mexican, you know, we have the greatest work ethic in the world. Africans.
And subscribe to the channel for more content like this. They don't want us sharing stories like this, but we're going to continue anyway with your support. The triangular trade. Now, let's dive a little deeper into what the triangular trade route was all about. The triangular trade route is simply the trade structure that operated across the Atlantic region. This triangular trade route across the Atlantic took goods from Europe to Africa. Some of the goods taken to Africa include arms, textiles, and wine. On the other side of the triangle was the movement of African slaves to the Americas and the West Indies. The last side of the triangle was the movement of raw materials such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton produced on American plantations back to Europe. The triangle involved three continents, with Europe providing the capital, Africa providing the labor, and America providing
What
the
I say?
land and resources. There was always
What did I say? Didn't I just say that? Africans got the greatest work ethic in the world. Let that sink in.
supply to the European market. The story of the transatlantic
Not even just saying work ethic, labor. We did the labor. We built this country. We have the greatest labor or we have the greatest work ethic in the world, bro. You put us to work, we can get that joint done. Period. In the world, my people stand up, man. We gotta. I'm not saying it's a like. I'm not saying that to glorify the fact that we was thrown in tough conditions and inhumane conditions to make us exercise our greatest labor skills. I'm just saying like we should have some respect put on our goddamn culture. Excuse my language. On our goddamn name. Excuse my language. And I just found out with the first. I think with Africa was the first called. I think firstly called. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's called uh, Akaban, Akaban, Akaban or something like that. I think it's called Akaban, Alikeban, Akaban. I think that was the name of Africa before it became Africa. Because I knew Africa is a white guy who was an explorer or something like that. For my Africans in the diaspora, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but I just found that out. I mean, if y'all let me know if I'm wrong or not, y'all know. Feel me, so family.
slave trade involves the story of all people in the three continents, but most importantly, those involved in the Middle Passage voyage. The trade route that transported slaves is known as the Middle Passage. The voyage is often marked with a lot of difficulties and even death. Depending on the weather, the voyage could take about 3 to 6 months. The passage was so brutal that the ships not only lost the people being transported as slaves, but in some cases, the crew also lost their lives. The mortality rate for sailors on slave ships was approximately 20%. The ships had a particular design and varied in size and passenger capacity. The conditions of these ships were inhumane. The African slaves were locked up below the deck in cramped quarters and only had a little opportunity to be out in the sunlight, and they were forced to carry out certain enforced exercises in the form of dancing to ensure that they were healthy and in good posture when they get to Europe. Inside of these decks was sticky and filled with the stench of dirt, feces, and urine. Research published in 1794 estimated that a man inside the deck had just a space of 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, and a woman had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. The girls had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air inside the deck was hot, stale, and filled with the incessant smell of dirt and human excreta. The slaves suffered from starvation and thirst, and only had 24 ounces of water every day, i.e., the equivalent of 2 12-ounce soda cans of fluid per day. Their major food was horse beans and rice. The captives were packed tightly in tiers below decks and were chained together, hands and feet. The voyage was characterized by many difficulties, and the captives were faced with issues that included epidemic diseases and attacks by pirates.
I ain't gonna lie. Sometimes it get tough watching stuff like that, bro. Just to know the conditions that those people that like, bro. Those people who are on them ships, who like the palm colored folks who deny us reparations when our ancestors had the fucking excuse my language, man. Like, did you not see the conditions that our ancestors had to be in, bro? Like, and you deny us reparations, knowing this? Y'all know they already know this, man. And the nerve of them to just deny us like that, because as y'all seen in my last video, how they just destroyed anything that we created for ourselves. Let alone bring us here to this country and all these other countries like this. And then say, we don't deserve reparations. And then when we did set up shop, set up our own little community, they destroyed it. They simply just destroyed it. Bro, when is it going to stop, bro? When is it going to stop? Seriously. Like, at this point, it's like, man, I don't know, man. I don't know. I feel the passion flowing through my brains, man. It's flowing through my veins, man. Like.
Also experienced physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. An estimate by historians put it that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died during this voyage. The conditions were so severe that only a tiny percentage of the Africans transported in the slave trade came directly to North America. Just about 4% of the total Africans transported, not more than 400,000, arrived in North America directly. A vast majority of the slaves were sent to the Caribbean and South America, and almost half of the slaves that were captured and transported out from Africa, totaling about 5 million, were sent to Brazil. I know you will be wondering how thousands of slaves couldn't overpower hundreds of crewmen. Well, there was one popular situation where African slave trades revolted and took over their ships. The detail of this story is as chilling as it is fascinating. We will get to that shortly, but keep in mind that the slave traders were armed and typically had the slaves in chains before transporting them. Anyways, let's finish up on the journey and the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. And while we may think that all slaves transported out of Africa were through the transatlantic route, that is not entirely true. The transatlantic slave only made up for half of the total slaves traded and transported out of Africa. It is reported that from AD 650 to 1900, Islamic traders were also exporting slaves out of Africa and sent out a total of 10 million slaves to Arabia, Yemen, Iran, India, and Iraq. The slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, while some slaves were also enslaved but remained in Africa. Many of the slaves captured and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were taken from the region bordering the Gulf of Guinea. The slave activities in this region were excessive, that the section of the African coast in countries like Togo, Benin, and Nigeria was even referred to as the Slave Coast. A majority of the slaves were taken from West Central Africa. In the early stages of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese generally bought Africans who were captured as slaves during tribal wars. But as the demand for slaves increased, the Portuguese began to enter the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives. In the 1690s, the number of people taken out of Africa yearly reached about 30,000, and a century later, the number grew to about 85,000 per year. During the 1700 and 1850, it was estimated that more than 8 out of 10 Africans were forced into the slave trade, successfully crossed the Atlantic. In the period between 1821 and 1830, about 80,000 people were leaving Africa yearly, and within the next 20 years, before the abolition of slave trade, over 1 million more Africans were sent across the Atlantic to America. By 1820, almost 4 Africans for every 1 European had been transported across the Atlantic, and 4 out of 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. The Africans who were sent to Brazil were mostly from Angola, and those who were transported to North America, including the Caribbean, were taken mainly from West Africa. Although just about 6% of African captives were sent to British North America in 1825, the U.S. population included about 1/4 of the people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly, the condition of slavery in America was totally different from that in the US. But before we delve into these mind-boggling details, let's talk about the Revolt of 1839. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. In 1839, slave traders were once again hoping to get another shipment of slaves across the Atlantic. But unlike previous voyages, they were not ready for the surprise this particular voyage would be bringing their way. The slave ship named Amistad had about 100 slaves on board. As the ship moved near the coast of Cuba, the unwilling passengers of the ship, who were recently abducted from Africa, numbering about 53, revolted aggressively. The revolters were led by Joseph Sink. They killed the captain and cook and only spared the life of the Spanish navigator so that he can sail them home back to Sierra Leone. However, the navigator managed to sail the Amistad northward. 2 months later, the U.S. Navy intercepted and seized the ship off Long Island, New York. The ship was towed to New London.
That's funny because that's exactly where I live, on Long Island. That's the Atlantic Ocean, bro. So I'm actually right there on the coast. If y'all look up Long Island, New York, that's exactly where I am right now. So that's funny. That's weird. That's crazy. I didn't know that. But Long Island there's a dark history in these waters about Long Island, bro. That's all I gotta say.
Connecticut, and the mutineers were held in jail in New Haven, Connecticut. This event had significant political and legal repercussions in the American abolition movement. At that time, the Spanish embassy demanded that the African slaves are returned to Cuba, and this led to the 1840 trial in Hartford, Connecticut federal court. New England abolitionist Louis Tappan was successful in drawing public sympathy to the Africans and was able to battle it with the pro-slavery U.S. government. However, the U.S. president at the time, Martin Van Buren, ordered a Navy ship sent to Connecticut to return the Africans to Cuba immediately after the trial. The interesting part of
Another thing about Long Island, we do have a ferry that goes from it's the harbor that goes from the harbor by Fire Island, I think. It's a ferry that goes from Long Island to Connecticut. I just wanted to mention that. That is true. Well, I don't know. That has nothing to do with, I don't think that was operating during this time. Like what we have today, the ferry going from Long Island to Connecticut, I don't think that was operating at this time. But I'm just mentioning that because it's a coincidence, and it's kind of ironic that we have a ferry. They took a boat from Long Island to, Connecticut, and we have a ferry that travels from Long Island to Connecticut today. So, yeah.
This incident was the legal proceeding that ensued. The prosecutors argued that as slaves, the mutineers were subject to the laws governing conduct between slaves and their masters. And this is where it gets interesting. The trial testimony showed that while slavery was legal in Cuba, the importation of slaves from Africa was not. The judge therefore ruled that the Africans were not merchandise, but were victims of kidnapping, and so had the right to escape their captors in any way they could. When the U.S. government appealed the case before the U.S. Supreme Court, the following year, former President John Quincy Adams was able to win the court ruling in favor of the Amistad rebels. The Supreme Court upheld the judgment of the lower court through contributions from private and missionary societies. The 35 surviving Africans secured a passage home. They arrived in Sierra Leone in January 1842 alongside 5 missionaries and teachers who later founded a Christian mission in the country. While we could definitely blame the Europeans for the activities of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans were also involved in slave trade activities. Africans were involved in kidnapping adults and stealing children for the purpose of selling them. They used European intermediaries or agents to sell off these captives in exchange for merchandise or arms. In most cases, those sold into slavery were usually from a different ethnic group than those who captured them, and it didn't matter if they were enemies or indigenous of a neighboring village. The captive slaves were stripped of any identity they had and simply referred to as other. They were not seen as part of the people of the ethnic group or tribe. Also, while African kings were very much interested in protecting their villages, in some instances, thieves and criminals were sold out into slavery as a way to get rid of them. Many other slaves were gotten through raids at gunpoint, which were organized by different ethnic groups, and in some instances, as a joint venture with the Europeans. Also recorded in the book, Daughters of the Trade, Atlantic Slavers, and Interracial Marriage on the Gold Coast, the author, Pernille Ibsen, shared that Africans on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, also participated in the slave trade through intermarriage. The term used was kasari, which gets its origins from Portuguese and means to marry. Kasari was used to form political bonds and economic connections between the slave traders and the Europeans. In the initial stages of slave trade, it was common practice for the powerful West African families to marry off their women to the European traders in alliance and to further enforce the syndicate. while the marriages had to be performed based on African customs. The Europeans offered no objection, as they were fully aware of how vital these connections were to the success of their businesses. In the initial stages, we may argue that Africans had no idea of the exact condition of the slave trade and the experience of those sold into the slave trade. However, according to Robin Law, there is a possibility that the royal elites of the Dahomey Kingdom must have had an informed understanding of the fates of the Africans sold into slavery. This is because the King of Dahomey sent diplomats to Brazil and Portugal who returned with information about their trips. Also, some of the elites of Dahomey had experienced slavery in America before returning home. So the only opposition the Kingdom of Dahomey had against slavery was the law that prohibited the enslavement of a fellow Dahomean. Anyone caught doing this faced the death penalty. And while the kingdom was against this, they had no issue with the institution of slavery. The case was different on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana.
I guess that would be the Caucasians' argument of, oh, you sold your own people into slavery. You sold your own people into slavery. I mean, according to history, from what he just mentioned, it's kind of true, but for a different reason. There was other terms. You feel what I'm saying? So I guess they'll generalize and say, oh, you sold your own people into history or into slavery.
Here, elites sent their kids to learn about the slave trade from the Europeans by sailing with them and living inside their forts. Some even sent their children to Europe and America to be educated. Elites on the Gold Coast also had agreements with the Dutch and British governments to rescue some of their friends who were tricked into slavery in America. However, a common assumption by many Africans who were not aware of the true purpose of the Atlantic slave trade was that the Europeans were cannibals who planned on cooking and eating their captives. This rumor even made it more distressing for the captives who were locked in ships sailing to Europe. The transatlantic slave trade led to an uncountable loss of lives for both captives in and outside America. A BBC report indicated that more than 1 million people are thought to have died during their transport to the New World. More died soon after their arrival due to terrible health conditions, although the number of slaves that died when bought as slaves is unclear. One thing we are sure of is that this number may exceed the number of those that survived to be enslaved. The Atlantic slave trade led to the destruction of lives and cultures. It is estimated that about 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries, and about 1.5 million died on board slave ships. And apart from those who died in the Middle Passage, it is also estimated that many Africans were killed during the slave raids and wars in Africa. Canadian scholar Adam Jones has characterized the deaths of millions of Africans in this period as a genocide. He referred to it as one of the worst holocausts in human history. Many believed that these deaths were not intentional and it was in the slave owners' interest to keep slaves alive and not exterminate them. Jones argues that the killing and destruction were intentional, whatever the incentives to preserve survivors of the Atlantic Passage for labor exploitation. To revisit the issue of intent already touched on, if an institution is deliberately maintained and expanded by discernible agents, though all are aware of the hecatombs of casualties it is inflicting on a definable human group, then why should this not qualify as genocide? Saidiya Hartman, an American writer and academic focusing on African American studies, argues that the deaths of enslaved people were incidental to the acquisition of profit in the rise of capitalism. She argues that death wasn't a goal of its own, but just a byproduct of commerce, which has the lasting effect of making negligible all the millions of lives lost. Incidental death occurs when life has no normative value, when no humans are involved, when the population is, in effect, seen as already dead. Saidiya Hartman goes on to say that although unlike the concentration camp or the Gulag, the Atlantic slave trade also led to the millions of corpses. In this case, extermination was not the major goal. It was a major corollary to the making of commodities. Who do we blame? Well, we could blame the Germans for the genocide attempt on the Jews. Who do we blame for the slave trade? 7 nations were actively involved in the activities of the slave trade and took most of the slaves to their colonies in the New World. We have the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Americans, and the Danish. The major sources of slaves include Angola Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, Gold Coast, Senegambia, Southeast Africa, and Indian Ocean Islands. Sierra Leone, and Windward Coast. The presence of European slavers also affected how the legal code in Africa worked. According to Kamani Nahusi, many African societies changed the punishment for certain crimes and the way they responded to certain offenders.
Google Pixel with Magic Eraser. Buy Google Pixel 7a and get Pixel Buds A-Series.
10K or more in debt? Listen up, I am shocked at how well this worked for paying off debt. I've been struggling with credit card debt for way too long.
For certain crimes and the way they responded to certain offenders. Some crimes, which were traditionally punishable by some other form of punishment, became punishable by enslavement, and offenders were now sold to slave traders. David Stannard, the author of American Holocaust, showed in his book that 50% of African deaths occurred in Africa as a result of wars between native kingdoms, which produced the majority of slaves. The practice of enslaving enemy combatants and their villages was widely practiced in West Africa. Indeed, the slave trade was largely a byproduct of tribal and state warfare. By selling off captives, they were also able to finance future warfare and also remove potential dissidents after victory. However, some of the African nations, such as Igala, Kabu, Bono State, Oyo, Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Oro Confederacy, were more brutal in this practice. Truly, Africans were fully involved in the slave trade and even aided it in many ways. But we can't take away the fact that the Europeans provided the incentives that made this activity thrive. In one of the letters written by Manikongo Nzinga Afonso to the King João III of Portugal, he writes to the king requesting that the king stop sending merchandise that is fueling the war between the different tribes. He begs the king to stop sending merchandise and rather send more missionaries. In one of his letters, he writes, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom is not a place for the trade or transport of slaves. Many of our subjects eagerly lust over Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them. After having taken these prisoners to the coast, secretly or at night, as soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron." Despite the vast consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, there have been worldwide apologies from different nations that benefited and grew their economy based on labor from the slave trade. In 1998, UNESCO designated 23 August as International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. This led to several other events that recognized the adverse effects of slavery on the African continent. In 2001, during the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations demanded a clear apology for slavery from the former slave trading countries. Some nations were ready to express an apology. However, the opposing countries, majorly the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, blocked any attempt to do so. The reason for this opposition by these countries could be due to concerns that accepting their involvement in slavery would also require that they make monetary compensations to the affected African nations. Since 2009, there has been a continuous effort.
See, I think that's low key the answer right there to why they don't want to give reparations, bro. They don't want to admit no involvement in the shit. Because if they admit involvement in it, excuse my language by the way, if they admit involvement in it, they have to admit to the fact that they destabilized the lifestyles and the livelihoods of those Africans who already had lives before they cooked them from their homes. And you'll have to give them monetary investments or some type of monetary gain because you affected their monetization of a lifestyle. You affected their money that they was getting. You owe them. Period. That's point blank what it is right there, black and white, white and black.
By the UN to create the UN Slavery Memorial as a permanent remembrance of the victims of the Atlantic slave trade.
But they'll build a bunch of damn statues and give a bunch of damn tributes and a bunch of damn speeches, but they won't give no money back to the people that deserve it, bro. Every last African on this planet deserves to have money in their pocket, due from any government around this country. Period. Because of what they destroyed. Mainly those countries they mentioned: Portugal, France, America, and the United Kingdoms. They don't want to admit involvement because they know they're going to have to pay some type of reparations, bro. Period. They just deflect blame or deny involvement, bro. It's crazy.
This video is crazy, but if you want to learn some more Black history that they never taught us in school, click the link in the screen. It's a
Thought I'd do way past cool, y'all. That's the video, man. I just wanted y'all to see that, watch that with me. But I hope y'all enjoyed that video. I'm gonna be doing either some more stuff like this, or just different content. I'm still working on that video with over 100 inventors. I just want to make sure I get it right. And when I do upload that video, there's gonna be a disclaimer. And yeah, but this is the end of the video. I just want y'all to see that for some background knowledge and history, because I learned something, and we all learn together. So that's what I made that for. So thought I'd do it past cool. It's your boy Woodard for signing out. Peace.